Hello? Okay, so this is lecture one. This is the first actual lecture on music. We had a lecture 0, which was just kind of like about how the class is set up and going over the syllabus. So, like I said in the last lecture, we're going to start at the beginning with a definition of the word music itself. And the book has a definition, which we're going to get to in a moment. But I asked you to come up with your own definition before you read the one that's in the book and send it to me. And I've gotten a bunch of definitions coming at me in the email. Thank you very much. And I said that the part of the reason for this is that it's just sort of like good intellectual exercise to try and come up with good definitions of things, especially those things which it might not otherwise occur to you that you might need to define, things that you've known about and been aware of your whole life, and you know perfectly well what they are. Things like music, for example. Everyone knows what music is. Everyone knows what love is. Everyone knows what science is. But try really defining these terms, and it's if nothing else, it gets you started thinking about them. And it's, of course, a good place to begin a discussion of anything, defining your terms. Okay, so I noticed that a lot of the definitions that came in, most of them, had something in there about the purpose of music being to express emotions. So this is a good example. This is something that we kind of take for granted. Of course, that's what music's all about, right? It's for expressing emotions. That's what art is for, isn't it? To express emotions. That's the whole purpose of art. And music is, I guess we could probably say it's an art. So, well, that doesn't have to be the case, actually. Art or music does not necessarily have to express emotions. Now, it might cause emotions within you, but it might not necessarily be the intent of the composer, in the case of a piece of music, or the artist generally, to arouse specific emotions. So that's not actually a necessary part of music, although it's, maybe we wouldn't really enjoy listening to music that doesn't express emotions. Maybe we would think it's a waste of time or whatever, but you don't actually need to express emotions, at least I would argue, in order to have music. Think about, so I'm going to sort of shoot down some straw man definitions before I get to the definition that's in the book. You might have someone say, well, music is sounds that are pleasing as opposed to noise. And again, first of all, who's to say what is pleasing? That's a very personal, subjective kind of thing, and one person's music might be another person's noise, right? I'm sure that my parents thought that a lot of the music I listened to when I was a teenager was noise, and maybe you had the same problem. By the way, noise is useful in lots of music. There's a technical definition for noise, which we will get to in the next lecture on elements of sound. And actually, you can have music that is made completely of noise, technically speaking, because all that noise is are sounds that do not have one particular frequency that we could identify or single out. Right? Disordered vibrations, and of course, sound is caused by vibrations. Disordered vibrations are technically classified as noises, whereas vibrations that are caused by regularly occurring vibrations, we might call tones or pitches. And lots of musical instruments actually produce noise. About half of the percussion instruments don't produce tones or pitches, they produce noise. So you could make music actually completely out of noise. People have done this. Right? So another thing that we might see something like, well, sounds produced by voices or instruments. Well, I guess you'd have to have some kind of mechanism creating the sound. Music definitely involves sound, right? But you don't necessarily have to have voices. You don't necessarily have to have conventional instruments, things that are musical instruments. You could make music, let's say instrumental music, using objects that are not musical instruments. Right? Now, here's the definition that bothers me the most, and it's one that you see all the time. And that is that music is a universal language. In fact, I wish I had it with me, but in my office at LHU, I have an old music textbook, actually, like a music appreciation textbook called Music, the Universal Language. And this bugs the crap out of me every time I hear that expression, because here's why music is not a universal language. Reason number one, it's not universal. And reason number two, it's not a language. When people say music is the universal language, I think what they mean by that is that everybody likes music. Everybody responds positively to music. But even that isn't true. Not everybody likes music. If you go to Afghanistan, which I don't recommend, the Taliban officially banned music because they consider it to be un-Islamic. That's kind of an extreme example, but there are people who don't care for music. And so it's not even true that everybody likes music. But what do we really mean? What does the word universal really mean? A universal language would be a language that everybody understands universally. That's kind of like what universal means applying to everybody in the same way. And I think it's really obvious that not everybody responds to music in the same way. That's why we have different categories of music and different preferences. That's why the music of one generation just doesn't really make it with another generation. And that's why, for example, we have to study the culture that music came out of. If you grew up in the West, in Europe or America or whatever, as I did, and you go to India and you hear a performance of Indian classical music, you might enjoy it. It might, generate some kind of emotional response within you, but there's no way you're really going to understand it in the way that a person who has grown up in that culture understands it. Right? So music is not universal. It's very particular. There are different types of music that grow out of different cultures and different generations within cultures. It's not at all universal. It's very particular. And maybe more importantly, it's not a language. Music is not a language. And here's why. In language, like the sounds I'm making right now as I'm speaking to you, or the letters that you look at when you're reading a book, those sounds or those words correspond to specific meanings. So, for example, if I say the word cat, or if you see the letters C-A-T, you're not thinking of a dog or a rhinoceros or a hippopotamus. You're thinking of a cat because you understand the English language. You understand the code C-A-T equals cat. Now, you might be imagining different types of cats, but you're imagining a cat when you see the word cat. But musical sounds, that is not melodies that are sung that have words, but I mean purely musical sounds like scales or chords or whatever do not have inherent embedded meanings. Right? I could play a C major triad on the piano, the notes C, E, G. And it doesn't have any particular meaning. Now, I might intend for it to mean something. I might want it to mean something. I might have my own little idea of what it symbolizes, or whatever. But C, E, G, those notes don't mean anything. They don't stand for something outside of themselves, the way that the letters C, A, T stand for something outside of the language itself. Now, certainly, composers have over the years and centuries developed in some cases, in some cultures, something like a language, in that if enough composers over time tend to use the same kinds of figures in the same way, then they're sort of referencing off of each other. And if this goes on long enough that the audience kind of understands, comes to understand this kind of language, you can have something approaching sounds within a certain context, musical sounds having a certain meaning. So, and this is how, for example, film scores work. When you go to the scary movie and you hear this ominous sound in the background, or maybe when you hear that sort of dissonant stabbing sound, which is first made popular in the Alfred Hitchcock movie Psycho, you kind of know what's happening. You know that something's about to, that's the kind of thing that music can approach almost the function of language. And this is something actually we will see, especially when we go back to the Baroque era. Well, it's going to be forward to the Baroque era because that's going to be about the middle of the semester. But in the Baroque era, when opera was invented, and opera was kind of like the equivalent of the movies back then. It's what people had instead of the movies. There arose this system, which we will learn about, called the doctrine of affections. Affections is a word that back in those days meant emotions. And the idea was that composers would consistently use certain musical figures or devices that over time audiences could understand to represent certain specific things, certain specific emotional states or moods. Right? But aside from that kind of systematic approach that can take generations really to sort of coalesce into something approaching a language, music is not a language because musical sounds do not have inherent intended meanings. There isn't a code there really. Music is much more abstract than that. In fact, I would say that music, particularly music that doesn't have words. Now, once you put words in there, there's a definite meaning that is intended. But without words, music is one of the most abstract art forms, really. Which is why it's interesting to me, I think. It's one of the reasons. Okay, so let's maybe look at what the book's definition of music is. See what we think of it. All right, so starting here on page 4, which is where Unit 1 begins. First, they talk about sound for a little while before they actually get to talking about music in the 5th paragraph down. It says, music is part of this world of sound and art based on the organization of sounds in time. That's the definition I'm going to go with. Now, even this definition has some problems, which I'll talk about. But if I was to have an official definition that would be on a test, it would be something having to do with organization of sounds, ordering sounds, and the full definition again, and art based on the organization of sounds in time. Let's look at that definition a little bit. First of all, music is an art. Okay? Should we define art? Very difficult. I don't recommend it. That could be a whole class unto itself. But let's just take it for granted that music is an art based on the organization of sounds in time. So all we really need to do is to take sounds, any kind of sounds, could be noises, could be tones, and if we intend to organize them in an artistic way, then the result is music. Now, whether it's good music or bad music is a little bit beside the point, but it could qualify as music. Now, one problem with this definition, and I can understand why they didn't go down this rabbit hole, but it's really not enough just to organize sounds artistically. That doesn't necessarily, I can think of another way of organizing sounds artistically that is not music. And that would be spoken poetry. Because if I'm reciting poetry, and most poetry, by the way, the history of poetry, it was recited really before it was written down. Right? And that's very often why it rhymed. That's why we have a tradition of rhyme and meter in poetry. It makes it easier to remember because it wasn't originally written down. Poetry was kind of originally meant to be recited or read aloud rather than necessarily read off of a page silently. But if I recite a poem, then I am creating sounds, right? And those sounds are organized with artistic intent. So this definition, and it all takes place in time, right? I'll get to that part of the definition in a moment. But why? What is it that makes recited poetry and not music? Why are they two different things? Well, because the difference, it seems to me, is that, remember what I said about how in language, the sounds are there to encode meaning. The sounds aren't really important in and of themselves, or at least they're not of primary importance. Their importance is to encode meaning, right? And in poetry, although a good poet will choose certain words for their sound qualities, right, they're choosing them primarily for their meaning. They're not going to usually choose a word that means nothing like what they intend for it to mean just because it has a pretty sound, right? The sounds are not the important part. The meaning that is encoded is the more important part. At least I think it probably should be. And it has to do with this fundamental difference between language and music, right? In music, the sounds are organized as sounds themselves and not so much as a mere code or a vehicle, a means to encode some specific meaning. So sounds for the sake of sounds almost, right? Rather than sounds for the sake of implying a certain specific meaning. Okay, so the organization or ordering of sounds in time. Let's talk about this in time part. In a way, that's maybe superfluous. Does it really need to be there in the definition? Because after all, I mean, time is a basic fact in the universe that we live in, right? It's one of those four basic things. You got matter, energy, space, and time. Everything in the universe exists in time. If it didn't exist, then well, it would be a very strange universe if we didn't. So music exists in time like everything else. Why do we need to put it in there? Well, I'm glad you asked. The reason is, it's that music exists in time in a special way. In the way that, for example, the visual arts exist in space. They don't really exist in time. Music, on the other hand, exists in time, but not in space. Here's what I mean by that. If you go and look at a painting or a statue or a great building, some kind of visual art, it doesn't change before your eyes in time. Now, of course, it's going to change over a long period of time. The painting is going to fade. The statue is going to get eroded or whatever. But that's not what I'm talking about. As you're experiencing the art, right, it doesn't change in time. Now, if you are walking around it, if it's a statue, or even in paintings, painters will very often try to give the illusion of movement in time because your eye is attracted to this part of the painting and that part of the painting, and maybe someone is gesturing or someone is caught in the middle of motion, suggesting motion. But obviously in a painting, there can't be any real motion. Nothing really changes over time. Now, again, the skillful illusion, an artist might suggest it, and some of the greatest artists deliberately do this kind of thing, but it's an illusion, it's a suggestion. The painting or the art exists in space only, and not really in time. In the same way, music really doesn't exist in space. It exists only in time. Every single thing about music is a manifestation of time and not space. Now, well, what about if you're, you could think of, for example, effects in music that have to do with space, right? Like, for example, you could have stereo speakers that are separated from each other in space, and you could have, let's say, a band where some of the musicians are over here and some of the musicians are over here, which gives you, so we could play with space, right? And certainly different spaces sound different, right? Because if you go into a church or a concert hall, a big space that has good acoustics, and you get that reverb, and your brain is telling you, wow, this is even if you got your eyes closed, wow, this is a big space because it sounds different. Surely space has something to do with sound and with music. Well, yes and no. Obviously, space is another, just like time, it's one of these fundamental things in the universe. And so music exists in space in that way. But really, everything that your brain is picking up when you are listening to sounds or when you are, including music, has to do with time. So let me give you an example. If you are in a concert where there are different groups of instruments over here and over there, and you can detect the spatial distance between them, the only reason you can do that, in fact, the only reason that you can tell what direction any sound is coming from. You ever think about this? Like, how can you tell with your eyes closed whether a sound is coming from over there or over there? Here's how. Because if let's say I'm a caveman, this is why we have this ability. It's a very useful ability. If I'm a caveman or some Neanderthal, and I hear the sound of a lion, it's important to know which direction that sound is coming from, because if I run away, I might be running toward the lion or away from the lion. I need to know which direction to run. So I hear the lion, and it seems to be coming from that direction. So I'm going to run in that direction. How do I know it's coming from that direction? Because when that lion roars and those sound waves start heading toward me, they hit this ear a little bit before they get to this ear, right? And that's the only way that I can tell. If I had only one ear, I would have no way of knowing which direction that sound is coming from. Got to have two ears in order to do that. And it's that tiny, tiny difference in time between the sound hitting here and the sound hitting here that my brain uses to figure out where that sound is coming from. It's just an amazing thing. There are so many amazing things about sound that you might never have learned about or thought about that we take for granted, but that's one of them. So anything having to do with space in music, like even the sound of reverberations, of echoes or whatever, that just has to do with time, really. It has to do with the way that this wave, the sound wave, is different in time, or maybe how it reaches one ear and then the other, in the case of detecting where a sound is coming from. It all has to do with time. Even, for example, different tone qualities, as we will see, and certainly different pitches, have to do with the different frequencies of the sound wave and also of the little sound ripples that are riding on the main wave, in the same way that there are little ripples on waves in the ocean. Right? We call these overtones. So we'll learn all about that when we get to talking about tone quality, when we talk about pitch, but it all has to do with time. Okay, let's take a look back in the book here. It says here, sound begins with the vibration of an object, such as a table that is pounded or a string that is plucked. The vibrations are transmitted to our ears by a medium, which is usually air. I'll talk probably a little bit more about this next time when I get to properties of sound. So that having defined music, then we will start next time talking more specifically about sound. Oh, here's what I wanted to do. I have this book on the subject of aesthetics. And you might remember actually from the syllabus, the word aesthetics. Because in the course goals, let's review. it says here, the two purposes of this course were to develop an understanding of the basic elements of music, and number two, to provide an overview of Western art music and the historical, philosophical, and aesthetic context within which this music was composed. So what is aesthetic? What does that word mean? That's a word you've probably seen before. You might have an understanding of what it means, or you might have just kind of figured it out from context. But aesthetics is simply the subject of beauty. What is it why do we consider some things beautiful and not others? What is beauty all about? That is the realm of aesthetics. And again, a very difficult thing to define, right? Beauty. Well, I have this book, which is really just a collection of essays on the subject of aesthetics. And one of these essays is by a guy named Gerald Levinson. And this is like a 5 or 6 page essay where he's just trying to come up with a definition of music, right? Which is what we tried to do ourselves. And in the end, he doesn't even really seem to come up with one that fully satisfies even himself. That's how difficult it is to do this. But having discussed this for several pages, here is sort of his tentative definition. Music, sounds temporarily organized. Temporarily, by the way, of course, means in time. Tempus, that has to do with time. But sounds temporarily organized by a person. So it's important that it be by a person. So birds singing, is that really music? Well, you might think it sounds musical, but it's probably not music exactly to the birds. It probably has a more specific function, which is to communicate something specific, and not just to artistically. Are birds being artistic? I guess we'd have to read their minds to know if they ever sing artistically to create something of beauty. Or are they trying to communicate something like, I want to be your mate, or whatever? Of course, a lot of music is doing that as well. But sounds temporarily organized by a person for the purpose of enriching or intensifying experience through active engagement, i.e. listening, dancing, performing, with the sounds regarded primarily or in significant measure as sounds. So that's what I was talking about. They have to be sounds organized for the sake of the sounds themselves, really, and not for some other purpose like to encode meaning, as in spoken poetry. But it's interesting, he uses the words that sounds organized by a person for the purpose of enriching or intensifying experience. So maybe that's about as close as he wants to come to saying, like organized for the purpose of expressing emotions, right? Expressing emotions a little bit too specific. As I said, you could have music that doesn't have any emotional intention at all. But it's harder to argue that you would be making music without at least trying to enrich or intensify an experience. And here's what I'm thinking of when I read this. One of the earliest types of music that we are going to look at in depth is Gregorian chant. Gregorian chant was for a very long time the official music of the Catholic Church. And it's basically prayer which is sung or chanted. And I think it's probably fair to say that this chant was not written in order to express emotions, unless maybe you could say the one emotion of piety, if that counts as an emotion, or reverence perhaps. It's not really, but I don't think that's really the purpose of this chant. The purpose of the chant was not to express your emotions or to get an emotional response from someone. The purpose of the chant is to praise God, right? And that's a different thing, I think. The purpose really is to praise God. And I don't know, does God have emotions? Maybe you're trying to influence God's emotions so that he doesn't strike you down or cause your harvest to fail or something. I don't know. But that's an example. music can have many different purposes, and they don't necessarily need to involve emotions, although they usually do in our experience, which is why it's understandable if you're writing a definition, you'd have something in there about emotions. So this definition instead has something about enriching or intensifying experience. Now, interestingly, in this essay, and also in the book, they mention one particular piece of music which really pushes this definition to the limit. So I said that music has to have sound, right? And it has to be organized in an artistic way, and that's pretty much all you need, right? Well, it just so happens there's a piece of music by this composer, John Cage, who died almost 30 years ago. You might have heard of this piece, actually. This is John Cage's most famous piece of music. The title of it is 4 minutes, 33 seconds. And this is a piece for piano. So you might go to a piano concert and you walk in, you get your little program, you sit down and you look and you say, ooh, oh, this pianist is performing 4 minutes and 33 seconds by John Cage. I remember hearing about this piece in my intro to music class. Wonder what that's all about. Well, you would sit down, the pianist would come out, and people would be clapping. The pianist would take a bow. He would sit down at the piano and do nothing for exactly 4 minutes and 33 seconds. In fact, what he might do is look at a stopwatch to make sure that the piece lasted 4 minutes and 33 seconds. And that's it. Now, you might say, how does this qualify as music? Because there's no sound to organize. Right? Well, here I think is what John Cage would say. Because he meant this, I don't think he meant this as a joke. He meant it kind of seriously. And Cage was a composer who's like very experimental and trying to sort of push the boundaries of the art of music in his day. And I think what he would say is, well, actually there is sound. Because all the people together there in the concert hall, they are going to be hearing sounds for 4 minutes and 33 seconds. They're going to be hearing, the sound of the ventilation system in the building. They might hear the sound of a bus passing in front of the concert hall. They might hear the sound of people coughing or sneezing or unwrapping their little candies or squirming nervously in their seats or shuffling their programs around. There are going to be some sounds. And you might say, well, those are just random sounds. Those aren't organized sounds. And Cage would probably say, well, you're right in that they are somewhat random, but there is some organizing going on. The first and most important way that these sounds are organized is that I have set a limit. It's right there in the title, 4 minutes and 33 seconds. We put a frame around these sounds. So any sounds you hear within these 4 minutes and 33 seconds are the music. And not only that, Cage would say, look, I organized this because, look, you find yourself here in a concert hall with a certain number of other people, right, in a certain time. And this particular sequence of sounds will never be quite the same, any two performances of the piece, but nonetheless, I've gotten these people here in this room together for 4 minutes and 33 seconds to listen to sounds that are occurring in this time and place. Therefore, there is some organization going on. Now, I don't think that anyone could go any farther than that. So Cage has, in a way, created the most extreme piece of music that's possible in a certain way, right? Because there's a minimum of sound and there's a minimum of organization, but there is some sound and there is some organization. So even that 4 minutes and 33 seconds, I would say, meets the definition, just barely, of a piece of music. When Cage composed this piece, by the way, of course, he was criticized, and there was one particular critic who said something like, one hopes that Mr. Cage will compose similar works in the future, but of greater length. Okay, I think, let's see. I think that's about all I've got for this lecture. So maybe for next time, just let's say read the first 7 or 8 pages. Let's say read up to read up to and including page 8, which goes over pitch, highness and lowness of sound, tone color, dynamics, and also, I believe, let's see. Well, it gets at the beginning of page 9, at least in the 9th brief edition, it gets into the different voices and instruments, and we can get to that later. So read up to page 9, and we'll cover that material next time on sound, on pitch, on dynamics. All right, see you then.